The new president had a favorite quote from Lincoln that he liked to carry with him on a scrap of paper. He'd used it in speeches, but it spoke to him personally. I know there is a God, and I know he hates injustice. I see the storm coming, and I know his hand is in it. But if he has a place and a part for me, I believe that I am ready.
We need to talk about the Kennedy siblings. Episode 16.
Welcome to Blood and Business.
I'm Bethany.
And I'm Cassie. Hi everyone, Cassie here. Just want to give a quick disclaimer. I am going to be using quotes from the 1960s in this episode, so there will be language that I would never use myself, but I do not want to change the historical accuracy of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. So just look out for those when you're listening to today's episode. The Kennedy family has so much that we can talk about that KFMs for now and forever are going to be a place where I can put more information and cover more stories. Today, obviously, we're talking about civil rights, and there is so much. And I know that we don't all fully understand it. So as much as we can share and read from firsthand accounts, it'll just make the story that much more powerful, because I only was able to dedicate like half of an episode to the stuff that happened in the 60s. But maybe one day, hopefully, we'll get to do another brother set by the name of King. I don't know what the other brother's first name is, but okay. So that being said, we are going to be reading yet again in our KFM. So I'm going to start with the Kennedy half century. It is a more historical, political account of JFK's legacy. It's less like personal biographical. And so it covers a lot of the civil rights stuff that happened that wasn't in the other books. When you think about JFK's presidency, you think of two things. You think of landing on the moon and you think of civil rights. And I think probably a lot of people think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I'm much less interested in that. But definitely civil rights, because it was the freaking 60s. And there had been more progress in that 10 years than there had been in the 100, or my dad would even like to argue the 200 years previous to that. But JFK, Jack, and Bobby were able to do what they did and were able to accomplish what they accomplished because of the environment and the movement that the civil rights activists and the Black community had prepared for them.
Yeah.
So we covered a little bit with the Freedom Riders and stuff like that in episode 16, but there are just endless little stories of really, really, really brave people, just regular, everyday people who took the responsibility upon themselves. They didn't grow up like Jack Kennedy. They didn't have the presidency to be able to wield the stroke of the pen, but they paved the way for Jack to be able to swipe the pen and to create change. And so I'm going to tell a lot of those stories, the surrounding
events that sort of led up to what we learned about in episode 16.
Yeah.
And the Civil Rights Act of
1963.
Was supposed to be 1963. Ended up being 1964.
Which, good to know, LBJ actually backpedaled a little bit. He enacted most of Jack's Civil Rights Bill that he wrote up in 1964. But then the voting rights and how Jack was calling for Congress to put in a law that all was required to vote was a 6th grade education. That didn't go into effect through LBJ until 1965. I think it was like a year delayed. So Jack was really like, we give him crap, but he was kind of swinging for the fences.
Yeah.
Like his bill was,
and that's
he was asking a lot.
He was asking a lot, and because there was so much information packed into episode 16, we didn't get to ad lib and like chat about how incredible and how risky and how progressive the Kennedys were, because to us, 2023 versions of American citizens think that obviously it was ridiculous and they should have been doing so much more. But then It's like with Rosemary. The more context that you get,
Yeah.
the more you're like, holy crap. They were literally on an island fighting for this. And even extremely progressive, brave, honorable people were not backing them in this.
Mm-mm.
People who were fighting poverty, people who were fighting stigmas with disabilities.
Yeah.
When it came to race, it was much more like acceptable for people to be racist, honestly.
The amount, like you said, the voting block that was the Solid South, quote unquote, it was going to be impossible for Jack to just right all wrongs in one stroke of a pen because it would have never passed through the Senate.
Right. Yeah. So what we see as the Kennedys not doing enough was them trying to find that balance of like how much can we pack in here without it being one
Thrown
thing
out
too
immediately.
far to
Yes.
where it seems so extreme that no one's on board.
Yeah.
So it was like they were having to hold themselves back in order to be able to accomplish anything. And I mean, MLK did the same thing. If you've read lots about him and his thoughts and his like practices career-wise, like he was in the game of politics too. And
absolutely. Because he knew he had to play the game to get anything done.
Yeah. And he was constantly finding the balance between how do I do enough so that my Black community feels like I've got their back and feels like I'm pushing hard enough without going too far to where I lose all funding and support from the white people that have my back. That would be constant. Like, I don't know how they just didn't die of heart attacks.
I have too many people-pleasing issues for that
Yeah,
job.
like that would be so freaking hard. But you know what they had in common? And the reason that they were able to do it is because they understood that it was rhetoric that really made the difference.
Cannot govern whatever million people when Kennedy was president by action.
They were so good at getting people behind their ideas and their beliefs. And honestly, that is a theme because Walt Disney, same.
Yeah.
Obviously, they were completely different people, MLK and JFK, but they had a lot of great leadership skills, obviously.
And a lot of infidelity.
And a lot of infidelity. And a lot of moral courage.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of conviction.
That is my favorite quote from the episode.
I don't think Jack understood civil rights at the beginning of his presidency, but he knew what was right.
This is The Kennedy Half Century by Larry J. Sabato. On Sunday, May 21st, 1961, hundreds of civil rights activists joined Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the First Baptist in Montgomery to show support for the Freedom Riders. This is the speech that we were talking about in episode 16. The Kennedys had taken the precaution of sending a group of federal marshals to provide security. When an angry mob surrounded the church, the marshals used tear gas to keep people at bay until the National Guardsmen could arrive to establish order and place the city under martial law. So that makes sense. The whole time, the plan was for the federal marshals just to be a temporary means until the National Guardsmen got there. Because I was like, why did they switch out? I didn't understand that fully. John Lewis, one of the young men inside the church. Are you kidding? At the time, who became an influential congressman from Georgia decades later, credited JFK with saving his life. Quote,
"Many of us probably would have been killed that night."
Lewis believed.
If you have not seen the John Lewis documentary, what is it called?
Good Trouble.
Oh, it's so freaking good.
He totally changed our perspective on what the Kennedys really did, because in the documentary, they ask him, so what did you think when Obama, the first Black president, was elected? And he said, I started crying. I uncontrollably was sobbing.
"I didn't think my feet were going to touch the ground. I cried. I was crying for Dr. King, for President Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy, my parents and grandparents and others, hundreds and thousands of people who didn't live to see this."
Oh my, full body chills. When he said that, I was like, oh, we don't have the right perspective.
We do not understand. He named Dr. King and JFK and RFK. Those were the three people that he named that he was sobbing for. One Black man and two white dudes.
We need to give some perspective that John Lewis was beaten. He was arrested like over 30 times, and he was at the front of the line when they marched from Montgomery, Alabama to Selma in the 1960s. When you think of like famous civil rights photos, it's John Lewis.
Mm-hmm. He put his life on the line to even put a drop in the bucket for the forward movement of civil rights. over and over and over and over. And still the amount of emotion, the amount of respect and gratitude for President John F. Kennedy and his brother, Robert Kennedy, is mind-blowing. It
astounding.
Was
I mean, it was shocking. Yes. And just to put more perspective into how important John Lewis is, when Obama was elected on his inauguration day, he wrote John Lewis and said, "It's because of you. It's because of you."
And then
Don't deny you did it.
Don't deny you did it. And when he was elected the second time, didn't he say, it's still because of you?
And that person.
Yeah, Obama thinks it's because of John Lewis. John Lewis thinks it's because of King and the Kennedys. And that's incredible. I always am shocked by how the Kennedys get such a lack of
respect
and just credit where credit's due. And I still feel like they're just like totally fine with it. They do not care.
Yeah, they did it. They did what they needed to do. I'm crying. I'm crying.
It's just so freaking cool because they were so selfless, and it just is over and over and over again. It's just like mind-boggling to me that what they're known for is
Marilyn
and Jackie and the FBI and the mafia. Just all of the scandal. And that is just so, that was like next to them, but that wasn't who they were. And it's wild how
it wasn't what they dedicated their life to.
We just, humans love to glorify gore. If it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead. I'm glad that we have these KFMs though, so that we can talk a little bit more and get more context and really understand how powerful and how inspirational these people were that were involved in civil rights in the 60s.
Yeah. And like you said, the more we read and the more we immerse ourselves into the environment of the 60s, the more I'm like, did I even do Jack and Bobby justice in the episode?
I know. Okay, wow. So when we were recording it, I felt like we're always paranoid about being too biased and too easy on the Kennedys because we obviously love them. They feel like
we're familiar with them. Yeah,
point.
Exactly.
So we're going to be biased when we're talking about them. So then we overcorrect always, and we're like trying to even it out.
Trying to be like, well, like they're not perfect. They're not amazing.
We're literally playing devil's advocate. If Jack did something, then we're going to like argue why that wasn't the right thing or why he could have done more or whatever. Then I'm editing it, and I'm like, we did not do them justice because they literally lost their lives for this.
But then I'm going to bleep you out because we'll circle back to say that. We held back on giving full credit and like just praising the Kennedy brothers because we don't know what it was like. And there was a lot of frustration with what Jack and Bobby were doing at the beginning of Jack's presidential term. And we don't know what it's like to be pushed down for that long, that severely. It's something that I know nothing about.
For a cooling off period. And that
like, are you serious?
Said, they've been cooling off for 100 years. If they cool off anymore, they're going to be in a deep freeze.
MLK said, wait means never, dude. It means never. I also wonder because LBJ had a really hard time even passing his watered down version of Kennedy's Civil Rights Act of 1963 in 1964. I wonder if it was Jack and Bobby would have had more weight to pull, if it would have been easier for them, if they would have been able to pass the whole bill at one time.
I kind of don't think so.
If it's just
only because their committee and their people were already abandoning them.
Yeah, literally. Do y'all remember that from the episode? Not a single person besides Bobby Kennedy,
the president's brother, was the only
approved
one
of Jack's movement in civil rights. Not a freaking single cabinet member. Mind you, he has appointed all these people. So they're his people. They're his people. And they still.
And a lot of them they knew previously. Like a lot of the people that surrounded JFK.
They were from his Senate campaigns or
people
family.
That they like grew up around. Right. People who should have had very similar beliefs. But
I think that they weren't like not supporting Jack necessarily. They were just seeing the temperature of the country and just not having faith that it's going to go well. And they wanted to obviously give Jack a second term in the presidency. And they're like, the country's not ready.
Him. Yeah, advising him to, don't do this if you want to run again.
Yeah. Which Jack decided.
I don't care.
To risk it.
Jack decided, RFK decided, and it was very convincing.
And now I will be pulling out Robert Aleck's book, An Unfinished Life, John F. Kennedy. When a Gallup poll in January asked the people in the South whether the day would ever come when blacks and whites would share the same public accommodations, 76% said yes. But the other polling data suggested that neither the North nor the South had a majority ready to see this happen soon. In May and June, when asked if integration should be brought about by every means in the near future, only 23% agreed. They're like, yes, that should absolutely happen. Now? Definitely not. 23% answered that they wanted any change that we can do to be put into place. 61% preferred gradual change. Even people in the North. So it's like they weren't working with a country of people who were like on board and then a Senate who was getting stuck. I mean, the
society
Senate
was saying no as well.
The Senate was reflecting the room.
As it should. However,
the Kennedys shared majority sentiment that peaceful demonstrations challenging Southern segregation laws would do more to hurt than to help bring about integration. Furthermore, later on, when Gallup asked, what do you think is the most important problem facing the country? Only 6% of people who answered the polls said racial problems or segregation, compared with 63% who answered war, peace, and international tension.
So, yeah, Jack was freaking voted into office for a reason.
Yeah, he was
what people wanted.
Yep.
But thank the Ursuline nuns
for this sound grammar, like
for the sound
him.
Mind that decided to change his freaking ways. And that's another thing. Let me just pull my mic a little bit closer.
Mm-hmm.
That's another thing that the Kennedys are so freaking good at. And if you get anything from these Kennedy episodes that you apply to your real life, do not ever be too prideful to change your mind.
Yes.
They changed their mind every freaking step of the way. They never thought that they had arrived and were constant.
It was their saving grace.
That was their saving grace because they were wrong, as we all are, a freaking crap ton because we don't know everyone. We don't understand every idea and we don't understand how everything works all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So the more we know, the more we should be developing, changing, and allowing other people to change and grow as well.
Absolutely.
Also, what was the other thing that Jack did? I feel like earlier on, maybe when he was a senator, that we were like...
He changed his mind?
No, not he changed his mind. He went against what everyone wanted.
Oh, yeah. Well, he wrote in his book, public opinion or like public majority does not always mean for the best politics or the best.
He learned that
from World War II.
Okay. That's when
because most people didn't want to fight Hitler.
Yes. Okay. That's why.
Yeah.
He was questioning if he was good enough. I think that he was also questioning, like, do I want to be a journalist? Do I want to go into
he was
politics?
Considering democracy and, all the different forms of government that he was seeing play out in the world. And he decided democracy, but
also
there are flaws.
Yeah, which is true, as we have seen here, that the majority of the country did not want actual equality for all.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking
that is heartbreaking
to admit, but yeah. So then a month later, 67% of an opinion survey thought that the administration was pushing integration either enough or too fast, and only 11% believed it was not fast enough. Kennedy was too much of a politician to challenge such numbers at the beginning.
Bobby was not.
The Kennedys remained sensitive to Black complaints about ongoing racial bias, but they also continued to hope that executive action would be sufficient. It was not.
They're like, hopefully our ability to override can compensate for these.
And then so they passed like this Plans for Progress program. By the fall of 1961, the New York Times reported that solid gains in Black employment were not evident at all. And one CEEO staff member described company commitments to more jobs for Blacks as, quote, not worth the paper they were written on. They were just absolutely meaningless documents. So they did try to do some executive decisions, and it just didn't land because if it wasn't
what actually needed
followed
to happen
through by the citizens of the country, it wasn't working. Kennedy himself worried that plans would, quote, turn out to be a fraud or a delusion or an illusion, that there were a lot of plans signed and then no Negroes would be hired. So there's just more to think about.
Yeah. So much of it is, how perfect does this look on paper and how does it actually play out?
Two very different things. So in this book, The Kennedy Half Century, African Americans weren't sure what to make of their new president. Even though an estimated 68% had voted for Kennedy, they wondered how committed he was to the cause of civil rights. Yet civil rights was not a high priority for the new administration. So that was the very, very beginning. Eventually, Kennedy's hand would be forced by public opinion. And this is where the freedom rides came in. Vicious violence in the Deep South had the unintended effect of raising awareness for the Freedom Riders' peaceful protest. Quote, for the Kennedy brothers, domestic affairs were an afterthought. Which is JFK's personality. He's just interested in world affairs.
And he was of the thought, extremely of the thought, that the United States was the greatest country of all time and wanted everyone else to have the same rights that we did. So I feel like because he was so a believer that everyone was created equal. It didn't matter what country you belonged to, what ethnicity, what culture, like everyone should be equal because they viewed people how God viewed people. Yeah. And we're so Catholic. And so if you have the responsibility, or if you have privilege, you have the responsibility to use that privilege to help others, the less fortunate. And for them, that was so like economic and...
Well, because the real truth is the United States, the domestic environment was the most progressive and the most free
of the world.
And the other countries, third world countries, who he's sending the Peace Corps people out to, are technically the most needed.
Yeah, like in
areas.
The most need. And
they
Jack
almost had
like
too worldly of a perspective.
Yes,
too wide.
We have all the resources and the best setup. Everyone should be a democracy. Everyone should have the freedoms that we already get to enjoy.
Which is a great perspective for the United States president to have. Like, you want him to think that this is the best country because he's representing us, you know?
Yes.
You want him to have...
He was just
pride.
So that way that it was a little bit out of bounds. He knew what was right and wrong. He just didn't understand civil rights.
He didn't understand
his presidency.
His own country fully, you know?
Yeah.
He didn't understand what was actually going on. And it took him seeing it. It took them putting it on a national stage for him to see what was really happening.
Mm-hmm. And then once he did, he acknowledged.
Like Rosemary.
Yep.
And that was Julian Bond saying that domestic affairs were an afterthought. He was the former chairman of the NAACP. He continues, and civil rights movements were an afterthought beyond an afterthought. Now, all of a sudden, chaos has broken loose. Attention is riveted. People are talking about this. The whole world is watching. So then maybe Jack also gets to see, wow, we can be the example.
Wow,
this can be a worldwide effective movement. Yes.
Yeah, to show people true freedom, true love, true Christ-like living.
We will lead by example.
And that this is possible because, I mean, honestly, this had never been done before.
Yeah.
There had never been a society like ours from the get-go, but to be so radical in those beliefs and to show people, to pave the way for others.
Yeah.
I think that you're right. That was probably a big motivator in that he finally put it into global perspective. Because also they were so obviously anti-communist and pro-democracy in trying to get people to want to be like the United States.
Yeah.
And that would be for minorities in other countries, even if it wasn't black versus white.
Free people is free people.
Yes. And we had already done that with religion, and it was time to do it with
Race.
We should have done with race before we did it with religion, but you know what? But yeah, wow, I had not thought of that. Not to give Jack too many excuses, but if you do think about what the beginning of his presidency was focused on, was obviously Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, the fact that we literally, black and white, might be nuked to the skies.
And that was obviously a huge weight on him and a huge focus of, okay, well, now that we have these nuclear weapons, what are we doing?
And he killed people. He was responsible for the deaths of like over 100 people.
And I think too, like, obviously he's learning how to be president, what that looks like, his
how to
role.
juggle everything.
It's like becoming a parent, but you're parenting all of
the
United
world,
States, kind of.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, he was leader of the free world.
People all over the world were looking to him, especially the free world. That is a huge weight, and those are like big shoes to grow into very quickly.
From a senator to that.
And you immediately you're immediately kind of failing at your job. So you're like having to start from negative.
If you're going to have a crisis like this, it's best to have it early. Exactly. And it's true. He was able to be more effective and more aware and make better decisions
because he was
in his presidency, because he was like shocked out of that.
Humbled.
You can't coast, dude. You are the president. Immediately, like 3 months in. Okay, so the book continues. In fairness, Bobby Kennedy cared more about civil rights than some of his official actions suggested. And that's kind of what we're realizing, that, yeah, it looked like they didn't get it at first. And I don't think that they did get it. But they cared more than they were able to act on because of the environment of the freaking 1960s.
Yeah, I mean, they were the most brutal and the most honest about how they actually felt in those private phone calls and in those conversations, that we only get a glimpse of how angry they were about people's racism and prejudice and lack of willingness to help them with the civil rights case.
Just in case you didn't know, it's more important for them to survive physically than for us to survive politically.
Which is a huge statement and shouldn't be that radical, but that is a bold, bold statement that most people in the political sphere would not be.
Yeah, probably not. And I don't even know. I don't know even today if people think like that.
No, because
genuinely.
And two, it's surprising because RFK might have not been as ends justify the means as I was thinking, because he was so for the individual underdog.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about this later on when Bobby
has his own political career.
Yeah, has his own, exactly, goes off on his own after Jack. But he starts learning and starts kind of changing his perspective once he gets more access to individual stories in people's lives.
Once he visits the Mississippi Delta, once he visits people who didn't grow up on the same side of the tracks that he did.
And because of the Mississippi Delta story that we talked about in episode 13, is it? 14?
No. 15.
I think that is one of those moments where Bobby realizes just because we live in the greatest, most free country in the world does not mean that we don't have major, major issues that are just as bad as third world countries.
One of the people who was around him, I don't remember if it was someone who worked with him, I think. But he said,
that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, he said, poverty is worse than I've ever seen in a third world country. And he couldn't believe that somebody in America could be so not taken care of, like so looked over. And that was bubble bursting for him. Like that was paradigm shifting.
I think it would be for everyone listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
I do not think that we understand the amount of, unless you grew up in it, truly grew up in full on poverty.
I'd like to also pop in here and say that JFK tried to pass a new program called Medicare that would provide medical care. I think it was like for anyone 65 and over, no matter what, whatever. I don't remember what all the logistics were, but it was called Medicare. It was free medical care, and it was denied by Congress. Like it did not pass.
And LBJ was the fight on poverty.
Right.
And that came obviously after Jack. So the state that
we can't know.
We cannot know. We don't understand how. And we still have a
huge issue.
Huge issue,
Mhm.
especially in the rural South. But
And in Appalachia. Is that the South? I guess that's the South.
back then, I mean, they didn't have TV. They didn't grow up with cell phones.
Yeah.
It was definitely an innocent oversight. And Bobby didn't even have that bubble burst until 67, 65. Years after Jack died.
Yeah. It was the same in 1947 as he would be in 1967.
67.
I think it was 7.
Okay.
Wow, the year our dad was born.
Oh my gosh, Daddy's old.
No, our dad isn't old. This is hauntingly close to where we're at right now in the span of time and space. That is so crazy.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Like that should not have
speeded up. The 60s, the 70s. I mean, once we were finally past the world wars, God, we could freaking actually do something for human rights. But yeah, the 60s, 70s, 80s, like
a
lightning
lot changed.
Speed. Yeah.
And then
a lot.
From the 90s to the 2010s, the internet changed everything. Okay, now this will blow your mind. So I'm continuing. In fairness, Bobby Kennedy cared more about civil rights than some of his official actions suggested. As a young law student at the University of Virginia in the early 1950s, which we talked about last KFM, that's part of Bobby's qualifications for Attorney General, he had pressured the college into allowing Ralph Bunche, an African-American diplomat and Nobel Peace Prize winner, to speak before an integrated audience, a social taboo during Virginia's Jim Crow era. During a 2012 interview, RFK's son Max described the dangers his parents faced on the night before Bunche's address.
And what year is this?
In the early 1950s. I'm not sure what exact year.
So early.
Oh my gosh, this is way before his time. This is still Jim Crow era. I mean, it is very widely accepted to be incredibly blatantly racist. So this is RFK's son, Max. Quote, "My mother, Ethel, says they were throwing things at the house all night. We didn't even know this about Bobby. They were throwing rocks through the windows and they were throwing things that were on fire. And it was a really scary night in the house for my mother and for Dr. Bunche and for my father." Max believes that this experience helped convince his father of the need for social change. "It was a critical period in my father's growth when he was beginning to look at the broader issues that were facing our country, but at a very communal level and at a place, quite frankly, where it was safe to do that." Can you believe?
My jaw is on the floor.
He was already putting his freaking life on the line. Pre-Jack ever even thinking about running for president. Early 1950s, this is like a decade prior to Jack being elected president.
And we know sort of how Ethel was raised, or Ethel's family's beliefs as well, because of her sister.
Yeah. Pat, the one that Bobby originally, well, no.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Not originally, but the one that Bobby
thought he was in love with for a minute. Was mistaken. But yeah, because when she had barely graduated high school, I think, or college.
She was in college.
Okay, she desegregated one of the most popular restaurants in New York City with just a black friend of hers.
I mean, that is at the front line of civil rights. It's in their blood.
Yeah, to me, it's just so apparent that they are not racist, like you said in the episode. The Kennedys were not racist.
And
Ethel was not racist. They just had to, they only have so much time in the day, and they're like trying to figure out what is the priority, and sometimes they just got it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
B, they're trying to water down their emotions about it, especially Bobby, clearly, in order to be able to
actually effective.
Yeah, long term.
Well, I'd also like to throw in, just from memory, Kathleen Not Kick Kennedy, RFK's daughter, eldest daughter, mentioned that she didn't even realize how progressive her family was for the time, but that Bobby, when he was a young boy, would play with all the local neighborhood kids, the black kids, and they didn't even think anything of it, really. Bobby, for sure, like as a kid, thought nothing of it. Rose was totally fine with that. And it wasn't until Kathleen Not Kick Kennedy grew up and was an adult, looking back and realizing that was the 1930s. That was unheard of.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the world that I think the Kennedys grew up in, that it's not an issue. What's the problem?
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's especially where Jack was coming from at the beginning of his presidency.
Which is why the activists say, I don't think he understood. He knew what was right. He knew what was right and wrong. He didn't understand
the severity of it.
Severity of the problem in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was just grew up in such a bubble.
Didn't know the Great Depression happened until he went to Harvard and learned about it in his textbook. Even though Joe Sr. hired extra gardeners to feed them.
I mean, you're kids, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Racism has to be taught. And they weren't taught it.
They were not taught it. So what's the issue if it doesn't exist?
So what's to complain?
And they were in politics like from kind of the get-go. Like as soon as they graduated college, Jack was...
Yeah, he was a journalist for like 0.2 seconds. And then he went and ran for the House of Representatives.
So everyone goes through this in their 20s when you realize like, oh, what the world actually is like and who people are. And your child brain shields you from so much.
And just your limited experience.
Your limited experience. You're just in school all day, every day, surrounded by the same people. Then you go off to college. Then you go off to get your master's. And their entire adult life was just in such a high-class, educated bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And they helped people. And when opportunities arose, they helped their family, they helped friends, they helped neighbors, they helped anyone and everyone that they could. But they were still just kids. I mean, even when they go to Great Britain and they are in the political climate with Joe Sr., they're still just kids and they're like working on their careers.
Absolutely. They're trying to get educated, not on social issues, on
they did not grow
philosophy and politics and literature and history,
theology,
and
like they're
government.
Yeah. Learning the ropes. They are not ever exposed to rural Alabama until they already are way into their political careers.
Yeah.
So it just makes sense when you think about it on like okay, what really happened here? It's that.
Yeah.
You don't know what you don't know.
Unfortunately.
Kick on the other hand, freaking hanging out with freaking Nazis. What is that? I truly do not think that she understood.
I don't either.
It's like Meep. When she realizes
she's telling them
going on, she's like,
oh no, they won't do that. Oh no, Hitler won't come here.
Yeah.
She's
like, y'all are all dramatic.
The Dutch are wonderful people. That Jewish guy is like, the Dutch are people. You don't understand the world. You're 22. Everything will be all right. Literally, that's what you think when you're 22. Everything will be all right. And no, it's not.
And no, you can't just keep dancing through it.
Okay, and here's a fun little behind-the-scenes anecdote from that story. Whenever MLK was going to give the speech at the Baptist Church to the Freedom Riders, King called Bobby and he ridiculed him for allowing the federal marshals to leave. And Bobby responded by, listen, you know as good as I do that you'd be dead as Kelsey's nuts by now if it weren't for the federal marshals. Here's some context. Max Kennedy, so this is Bobby's son, noted that King mistrusted the Southern white marshals who had been sent to provide security, and he made his views known to the Attorney General. Quote, Dr. King got on the phone with my father and said, listen, these marshals you've sent aren't worth a damn. They're all racist and they all want to kill me. And my father said, Dr. King, if you didn't have those men there, you'd be dead as Kelsey's nuts. John Siegenthaler didn't know what Kelsey's nuts were. By the way, John Siegenthaler is the one that I want to do a minisode over. He's the Nashville reporter who was there for the decision-making meeting. He thought it was something kind of sexual, which he'd never heard my father say in his life.
Yeah, Bobby was the one who wouldn't
listen or tell dirty jokes, even in middle school.
So John Siegenthaler is like,
oh my gosh,
what's going on?
I'm mortified. Later, my brother Christopher talked to a Marine who said that they were the lug nuts on the Jeeps that were very hard to loosen, and the phrase was supposed to be tight as Kelsey's nuts. But my dad got it mixed up.
Like nuts and bolts.
Exactly. And it's not supposed to be dead as Kelsey's nuts. It's supposed to be tight as Kelsey's nuts because those are the most important, tightest nuts on
your car's like going to fall apart.
Yeah.
So like lock it down, like make sure it's good to go.
So MLK is like, what are you talking about? And the whole time, it's like, Bobby, for real? You don't know what you're talking about.
Make like a tree
And get out of here.
That's so funny. Oh my gosh. And did Bobby think it was nuts as in like balls? Or he thought it was... I think that Bobby thought it was nuts as in nuts and bolts. But
you'd be
Bobby
dead. Dead as a doorknob. Dead as
Kelsey's nuts.
Kelsey's nuts. Exactly. And that. Okay. Yeah, because I'm
doing what I can.
If it was something sexual, it would be dead as nuts. Like, I think you're right. He probably thought it was like metal, like aluminum. You would be dead as steel.
As a door.
As a doorknob. Bethany and Bobby. Okay.
Dead as a doorknob? I think it's dead as a doornail.
No, it's not. Dead as a doorknob. Does it? Does a doorknob? Okay, maybe people say both because honestly, it would be the same. It would mean the same thing.
He's just like an inanimate object that is not alive.
You'd be
dead as that. Okay. Lifeless.
Your soul would be in heaven.
Or the nuts.
Now, here's actually some more perspective, more context on Bobby Kennedy's quote-unquote cooling off period. Bobby Kennedy's plan was to move the Freedom Riders out of Alabama as quickly as possible. I thought that people were going to be killed, he said in 1964, and they had made their point. What was the purpose of continuing with it? He called for a cooling off period. James Farmer, director of the Congress of Racial Equality, told a reporter. We had been cooling off for 100 years. If we got any cooler, we'd be in a deep freeze. Kennedy insisted the racial troubles would embarrass the president in his meeting with Khrushchev. That's another context. Ralph Abernathy, King's chief deputy in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, replied, Doesn't the Attorney General know that we've been embarrassed all our lives?
Oh.
I also do want to kind of give just an explanation of what the whole voting situation was. Why is everyone so upset? Okay, so the people in the South were so freaking evil and manipulative and racist that they would require, instead of just saying, oh, you went to school, or oh, you can read this piece of paper, you can read the names on the voting ballot, you should be able to vote. They were making people do literacy tests, which I think was technically lawful. But instead of an actual literacy test,
like a
fair piece of paper, like with basic sentences, whatever, just to know, are you able to even understand the ballot? No. They were literally making crap up like, oh, here's a literacy test. Count the bubbles on this bar of soap. Well, as they're counting the bubbles, they're popping. The number's always going to be wrong. So literally, they were just shutting people out who wanted to vote because of the color of their skin and making it impossible to qualify to vote.
That means these people are sitting there in meetings,
conniving, scheming. That's why I'm saying, like, this whole racial thing is I've never seen the passion and the conviction behind hate like that, other than like Hitler, you know?
Yeah, which kind of is race.
But where these freaking Southern people come up with racism attributed to their religion is beyond me. And that's why a lot of people in the White House, including LBJ, just straight up asked people, like, are you familiar with your Bible that you quote so often? Because your interpretation is nowhere near anything I've read.
Yeah.
So in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, quote, Kennedy had a different kind of confrontation at home to manage. In June 1962, the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ordered the University of Mississippi to admit James Meredith, a Black Air Force veteran who believed that God had chosen him to challenge the state's segregation laws. Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett, a Democrat, rejected the federal court's order and told his constituents that he would, quote, not surrender to the evil and illegal forces of tyranny. The Kennedys, embracing their constitutional responsibilities, urged Barnett to obey the law. But the governor proved to be stubborn. He knew that racial integration was the third rail of Mississippi politics, and that if he bowed to Washington's will, his constituents would punish him and his party at the polls. Instead of complying with the court's order, Barnett physically blocked Meredith from registering while giving a states' rights oration explaining his resistance. The Kennedys made several attempts to negotiate with the governor and thought that they had found a reasonable solution. If Barnett maintained law and order, they would keep their troops on the sidelines. But the brothers knew better than to fully trust the governor and took additional safety precautions. Following established law, President Kennedy seized control of the Mississippi National Guard and dispatched federal marshals to protect Meredith. He also went on television to remind Americans that the United States was, quote,
founded on the principle that observance of the law is the eternal safeguard of liberty and defiance of the law is the surest road to tyranny.
At the same time, Kennedy attempted to console white Southerners, most of whom were fellow Democrats, quote,
I recognize that the present period of transition and adjustment in our nation's Southland is a hard one for many people,
he said.
Neither Mississippi nor any Southern state deserves to be charged with all the accumulated wrongs of the last 100 years of race relations. To the extent that there has been a failure, the responsibility for that failure must be shared by us all, by every state, by every citizen.
It's kind of what MLK was saying. The white moderate is the problem.
The eyes of the nation and of all the world are upon you and upon all of us,
said the president.
And the honor of your university and state are in the balance. I am certain that the great majority of the students will uphold that honor.
Alas, and inevitably, many did not. And on the evening of September 30th, 1962, Mississippi's campus became a war zone. An enraged mob of thousands hurled bricks and glass bottles, at Meredith's dormitory while angry shouts and gunshots echoed through the humid night. Governor Barnett, whatever his name is, withdrew his state troopers and let the federal marshals fend for themselves. 2 people died.
Oh.
And hundreds of others were injured, including 27 marshals who suffered bullet wounds. Kennedy finally ordered federal troops to the scene, though they arrived too late to repel the initial waves of violence. It had certainly not unfolded the way that the president and the attorney general had envisioned, and they were criticized and were critical of themselves for poor planning. James Meredith blamed
the lack of clear authority
in Washington for the fiasco, but he also remained optimistic that the civil rights movement would ultimately triumph. A year after the riot, having finished his degree, Meredith waxed optimistic in a letter addressed to the Attorney General. Quote,
today, regardless of all other considerations, I am a graduate of the University of Mississippi.
I'm going to just literally sob.
For this, I am proud of my country, the United States of America.
He was also proud of the marshals who had risked their lives for his safety. Quote, if I had no other measure by which to evaluate the trend of the American mind than the United States Marshals with which I came in contact during my stay at the University of Mississippi, I would be very much encouraged. The Marshals, many of whom were Southerners themselves, in addition to their security duties, were a constant reminder to me that white Americans could and would respect the rights of other Americans. And dude, if he hadn't been so confident in his mission and the importance of it, he might think, oh my gosh, because of me, 2 people died. Oh my gosh, because of me, 27 marshals got shot, But he knew. He had such assurance that what he was doing was worth it, was important, was right. It's incredible. The Kennedys weren't as optimistic as Meredith about race relations. By the fall of 1962, they were worried about pushing too hard and too fast on civil rights, and the bloodshed in Oxford had shown them what might happen if they did. President Kennedy refused to ask Congress for a strong civil rights bill and waited until the midterm elections were safely behind him before signing an executive order banning discrimination in federally funded housing, a promise he had made long ago. So that's what we were talking about, the executive order. So then early in 1963, Birmingham police decided to arrest King's followers for the smallest little legal infractions. And then in May, they weren't just arresting them anymore. They were violently beating them and assaulting them. When a crowd of protesters, including young children and high school students, marched in defiance of a city ban, Connors, which Connor is the Birmingham's police commissioner, when Connor's henchmen used German shepherds and pressure hoses to mow them down, the television images were flashed across the world. President Kennedy saw the pictures the next morning in the New York Times and told an aide they made him sick. Jackie Robinson again blasted JFK for sitting on the fence. Quote, "The revolution that is taking place in this country cannot be squelched by police dogs or high-power hoses," he observed. "I must state bluntly that there will be grave doubts as to the sincerity of your administration unless you face this issue in the forthright manner with which you handled the steel industry and the Cuban situation. The eyes of the world are on America, and Americans of both races are looking to you." He's like echoing his words back at him. Remember what you said? Remember that all eyes are watching you? It's also something that John Lewis had mentioned in his documentary, that German shepherds and high pressure hoses are not going to stop us because we've lost the fear of you. And once you lose...
I think I wrote down such a good quote that goes along with this, but sorry, keep going.
No, you say the quote.
MLK said,
"We will meet the capacity to inflict suffering with the capacity to endure suffering. Do what you will to us, but we will wear you down."
That gives me chills.
They were just done.
You can hose us, send German shepherds at us, beat us. We are not going to stop. This is too important. And there are too many of us willing to risk it all for this.
Yeah. And John Lewis, straight up, with the amount of times that he was arrested, he truly lost his fear. Seriously.
Yeah, he said that, what exactly did he say?
It was something like,
"At this point, I had lost all fear. And if you fear nothing,
you're unstoppable."
Yeah.
Okay, also what's really cool is that the Black community and a lot of the activists or people who were just forwarding civil rights, they figured out the best way to fight. And that was first, obviously, to get national attention, but also to take away the money. So they organized several protests and boycotts. One of them was a bus boycott where they all agreed, all right, none of us are riding the bus. We will not be paying the bus fares because all the buses obviously had segregation laws or segregation practices. And I think it might have been in response to Rosa Parks. But they basically created their own public transportation system straight up. They had volunteer drivers that would give rides to everybody who were too far away to walk. Most people just were walking, but a lot of people obviously still needed to go pretty far to their jobs or wherever. And they would just have volunteer drivers picking people up, dropping people off. That is amazing. Then there was another one where they all agreed to only buy food and medication for the entire quarter, the business quarter. So Macy's, JCPenney's, all these places basically lost an entire quarter of revenue from a year. And immediately after that, I mean, you pull those numbers and you look at your losses and you're like,
shoot,
whatever you guys want.
Yeah.
So it was effective.
So freaking cool.
In his heart, Kennedy must have known that Robinson was right. He sent Burke Marshall, an assistant attorney general, to Birmingham to negotiate a truce. So the Justice Department, they had come up with a compromise of sorts, and unwilling to endure a permanent loss of profits, Birmingham's business leaders agreed to gradually desegregate the city's schools, lunch counters, and department stores. But not every Alabamian was ready to surrender so easily. Bombs exploded in front of a Black-owned motel and Martin Luther King's brother's house. In response, the blacks attacked the city police and firemen. At the same time, Governor George Wallace, he was notorious. I think he's the one that said segregation now, segregation forever. He was blocking the right here. He was blocking the integration of the University of Alabama. In late May, JFK met with civil rights advisors who suggested that Jack urge Black and white Southerners to convene jointly for a series of peace conferences. Quote, "The people in the South haven't done anything about integration for 100 years, the president replied. And when an outsider intervenes, they tell him to get out. They'll take care of it themselves. Which they won't." So they're slowly starting to get this better picture of what the heck's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Then, finally, Jack understood. And on June 11th, 1963, regular programming on all networks was interrupted for a special address from the president. "Good evening, my fellow citizens." And then he began to lay out the Civil Rights Act of 1963. The day after Kennedy's speech, the day after, a white supremacist named Byron de la Beckwith shot and killed a 37-year-old civil rights leader, Medgar Evers, who was walking up the driveway to his own home when he was struck down. His murder was witnessed by his 2 young children. And there is a movie about this with Whoopi Goldberg. It's called Ghosts of Mississippi. On June 13th, so 2 days after his speech, 1 day after Medgar Evers was shot and killed, JFK wrote a letter to Evers' widow that in some ways would apply to the president himself in 6 months.
Oh my gosh, that gives me in 6 months.
Although comforting thoughts are difficult at a time like this, surely there can be some solace in the realization of the justice of the cause for which your husband gave his life. Achievement of the goals he did so much to promote will enable his children and the generations to follow to share fully and equally in the benefits and advantages our nation has to offer.
In the margins of the letter, he scrawled a handwritten message, quote, "Mrs. Kennedy joins me in extending her deepest sympathy." 6 days later, President Kennedy sent to Congress that civil rights bill. Guess freaking what? This is something that John Lewis mentioned in his documentary because he was a speaker at this event. The March on Washington was supposed to originally go straight up by the White House and be right outside Congress. And Jack and Bobby asked them please to move it to the Lincoln Memorial, which ended up being such an iconic location that it became forever enshrined in such cinematic masterpieces as Forrest Gump. It was a really effective march, obviously. People were back and forth on if it was going to be harmful or if it was going to be helpful. And at first, Bobby was against it, but Jack ended up promoting the march. But in addition to the location amendment, he also asked John Lewis, the 23-year-old president of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to water down his passage in his speech that was critical of the Kennedy Civil Rights Bill.
Oh.
And remember what John said? He was like, "Sure, I'll do it." But on August 28th, hundreds of thousands of people gathered on the National Mall for the, quote,
"Great March for Jobs and Freedom."
High school groups sang, clapped their hands, well-dressed men and women, including many white and black college students, carried signs and shouted slogans. Bob Dylan and a bunch of other celebrities entertained the crowd. And then, in the late afternoon, under Lincoln's watchful gaze, King delivered for the ages his "I Have a Dream" speech, which, according to historian Robert Dallek, who wrote An Unfinished Life, sitting to my right, the speech, quote,
"genuinely impressed and moved Kennedy."
But the president knew that the fight for reform would involve more than just organizing a march or delivering a brilliant speech. And now I will be pulling out Robert Alec's book, An Unfinished Life, John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963.
Wow.
Which has
How
been...
are we in the 60s?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh, literally we're at the end.
We're at the end.
And this has been our Kennedy Bible for this season.
If you have not yet, you have got to go watch an interview of Robert Alec because I think he's so cute.
Yeah, he is. Has everyone heard about this rumored story, this legendary story that once Bobby Kennedy was in a meeting with several civil rights activists, and one of them said, "Oh, if I was called upon to fight for this country in war, I never would." Remember that?
What?
And Bobby just could not understand. Like, he was so shocked, upset, pissed off
That he wouldn't fight in
that
war?
he wouldn't fight for his country. How could you do that? Because he grew up in the Kennedy family.
Yeah.
Where you fight for your country. No questions asked. What are you talking about?
Uh-huh.
And Bobby's like, I'm sticking up my neck out here for you, and you wouldn't be willing to fight for us? What are you doing? What are you talking about? Like, he could not understand. Bobby met in the Kennedy's New York family apartment on Central Park South with an elite group of Black activists. James Baldwin, the author of a disturbing November 1962 New Yorker article on the condition of Black men in America, organized the meeting at Bobby's request. Jerome Smith, a Black radical, dominated the discussion, describing himself as nauseated by the necessity of being in the same room with the Attorney General. The fact that he had to explain the personal abuse inflicted on him in the South showed, he said, what little progress had been made in race relations, and he doubted that he could follow King's prescription of nonviolence much longer. Indeed, he didn't even feel he could fight for America were he ever asked to do so. Bobby's evident anger at Smith moved the playwright Lorraine Hansberry to say,
"Look, if you can't understand what this young man is saying, then we are without hope at all, because you and your brother are representatives of the best that a white America can offer. If you are insensitive to this, then there's no alternative to our going in the streets and chaos."
Oof.
When Schlesinger listened to a stunned Bobby describe his distress over the encounter, he feared that Bobby's, quote,
"final reaction would be a sense of futility rather than the urgency of trying to bridge the gap."
Schlesinger need not have worried. However strong Bobby's initial indignation, he shortly asked the Senate Judiciary Committee, quote,
"How long can we say to a Negro in Jackson, when war comes, you will be an American citizen, but in the meantime, you're a citizen of Mississippi and we can't help you?"
Oh.
Wow. And
kind of the same sentiment of the whole Catholic thing.
Yeah.
Not Kathleen Kennedy.
It's not a freaking problem when we give our lives for our country, but when we want to lead our country, it's a problem.
That we're Catholic. Yep. So that helped them too.
Yeah. Those experiences
understood.
they were able to apply. So this is just before Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill. An outburst of violence in Jackson at the end of May against protesters trying to desegregate a Woolworth's lunch counter, combined with demonstrations over integrating Baton Rouge, Louisiana schools, strengthened the Kennedys' resolve to ask Congress for comprehensive civil rights legislation. On June 3rd, when Louisiana Governor Jimmy Davis told the president, quote,
"Either we have federal orders to stop some of these demonstrations,
marches,
or it is going to spread,"
Kennedy replied,
"It's going to be up north. This isn't anymore just a Southern matter. It's Philadelphia, and it's going to be Washington, D.C. this summer, and we're trying to figure out what we can do to put this stuff in the courts and get it off the street, because somebody's going to get killed."
Somebody very close to home. I think you're right about it not being any easier for Jack and Bobby to pass the same civil rights bill. This says, it was clear to Kennedy that getting any kind of civil rights law would require an all-out lobbying effort. He needed to enlist as many groups as possible to bring in pressure to bear on uncommitted congressmen and senators. I mean, it was just... On August 1st, a reporter at a news conference asked Kennedy to say, quote,
"Whether civil rights are worth an election."
Kennedy replied, he believed that whoever was president would meet his responsibilities by advancing the rights of all citizens to equal opportunity. Doesn't matter if it costs me the freaking election. It's what needs to be done.
Yep.
And I'm the president. The march marked a memorable moment in a century-long crusade for Black equality. Its distinctive features not violence or narrow partisanship on behalf of one group's special interest, but a dignified display of faith on the part of Blacks and whites that America remained the world's last best hope of freedom and equality for all. That the fundamental promise of American life, the triumph of individualism over collectivism or racial or group identity, might yet be fulfilled. Nothing caught the spirit of the movement better, or did more to advance it, than Martin Luther King's concluding speech in the shadow of Lincoln's memorial. Quote, "I have a dream. ... I'm not going to say that because I want to save it for the other episodes, but I am going to say that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. And when this happens, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." Join us here next week to hear all about how tragedy struck the Kennedy family again, and Jack lost the dad he had always known, and the strong presence that had always had his back. Thank you all for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please give us a review on Apple, rate us on Spotify, and share Blood and Business with a friend or a sibling. If you'd like to support the show, the best way is to become a patron of Blood and Business. You will get bonus content every month, including a monthly bonus episode, interactive main episodes, and behind-the-scenes footage.
To keep up with us day to day, you can follow us at Blood and Business on Instagram and TikTok. You can find the link for Instagram, TikTok, and Patreon in the show notes below. Thank you so much for the support, and we will see you back here next week for your regularly scheduled programming on
Blood and Business.
Bleh. And if we could all be so strong and courageous.
And so selfless. And it was hard, but he did it.
And guess who got assassinated?
And KFM 10.
And
we come right back.
2 out of 4. There's only been 4 ever presidents to be assassinated. And 2 of them are Lincoln.
Were a response to forward movement in civil rights.